Yeah, this is nothing I'm used to, but this is gonna be fun. Let's get into this. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel and thanks so much for tuning in. Today we're getting started on the build of my new Team Associated RC10 B6.3 two-wheel drive off-road racing buggy. Now, I've already posted an unboxing video on this car, so if you want to check it out, I'll post it in the cards in the top right corner of the video, and I'll leave a link in the description below. But for those who have been following along, you'll know this is my first brand new kit from Team Associated, which means I'm really unfamiliar with how this car will be going together. So in order to familiarize myself, I went through the manual after my initial unboxing to gain a better understanding of the build and what to expect. And I will say, the manual itself is really well illustrated and laid out and fairly clear, which has actually alleviated a lot of the concerns I had going in. Now, I should mention, today's video is part of a build series on this car, so I won't be assembling the entire car in one sitting. Instead, we'll be focusing on parts bags 1 and 2, which will basically be the steering rack and front lower suspension. I'm doing this to try and keep these build videos a bit on the shorter side. I'll also add time markers in the description as well, so if you're building your own B6.3 along with me and want to reference or rewatch a specific part of the build, you can do so without scrubbing through the entire video. Speaking of which, if you want to follow along with the build series, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the little bell icon to get notifications of when I upload the next video. Now, before we get into the build, let's talk a bit about some of the tools I'm going to be using today. First off, I have a 1.5mm hex driver, a 2mm hex driver, a 5.5mm nut driver, a hobby knife with a brand new number 11 blade, a pair of scissors, a pair of needle nose pliers, a pair of flat cutters, a set of tweezers, a digital caliper, some blue thread lock, and a magnetic tray for holding fasteners. All right, so now that we've run through all that, let's start this build by getting into parts bag 1. All right, so I've now emptied out all of parts bag number 1. I've actually organized all of the bits and pieces. So we have all of our plastic pieces in the bin right here. We've got all of the bearings in here, and I've sort of grouped them all into their various sizes. And I've taken the hardware and sort of grouped them into their various sizes and types as well in this bin here. So I've got everything sort of organized from parts bag number 1, and we're gonna start with step number 1 in the instructions right here. Now, step number 1 calls for us to use the steering rack. So this is actually the assembly of the steering rack and the steering bell cranks. Now, in my case, I'm not actually going to be using the plastic kit set, but instead go with the upgraded steering rack from Team Associated. And so I have actually done exactly that. So you guys can see right here, I have the upgraded aluminum bell cranks and the upgraded aluminum steering rack from Team Associated. This is part number 91668 for the bell cranks and 91669 for the steering rack. So let's open these up. Like I said, I'm not going to be using the kit supplied items. I'm going to leave these here and we'll open these up right now. Okay, here are the bell cranks, the aluminum bell cranks from Team Associated. And as you can see, what came in the bag was, of course, the 2 bell cranks and a small aluminum washer, which I believe looks to be a 2mm thick washer. There's only one in the bag. So place these off to the side, and we'll, as well as, of course, I should mention, a supplemental instruction manual, which will be following this as opposed to what's actually in the manual here. And it's one-sided. So now that we have those open, let's take a look at the actual steering rack itself. Okay, and here we can see the aluminum steering rack from Team Associated, as well as the supplemental assembly guide that also came with it. Again, single-sided, and we'll be following this as opposed to the instructions in the manual. But I have to say, just looking at these aluminum pieces, I mean, this is wonderfully well made. Wow. Okay, let's get into this. Step number 1. So bag 1, step 1, here we go. Now, I got to make sure that this thing is properly oriented. So looking at the manual here, it should be in this sort of orientation. All right, so let's get started. First, we need some bearings. These are 3x7x3 bearings, and we're going to need 4 of those. So you guys can see that. All right, hope you guys can see that. So there's 2 bearings up top, 2 bearings below. Great, so there's that. I made a small mistake here. So the two bearings also need two flat washers, 1 mil flat washers, which came out of parts bag number 1. There we are, so that's now done it. There we have the steering rack with the bearings installed. Next, we need 2 heavy-duty ball studs that are 8 millimeters long, which I believe are these right here. Now, before installing these ball studs, we do need some blue Loctite. So now, little tip, I'm just using a little piece of plastic here to put a little bit of the blue Loctite on here. It'll just make it easier when applying. You can use tinfoil or anything else. I just happen to find this piece of plastic. I'm going to be using that. So that's the rack assembled. Now, unfortunately, and this is a bit of an issue, it does show 2 washers being installed underneath these 2 ball studs here and here, but they're not included in any of the kit. So for the time being, I'm going to leave them out. So next we assemble the steering bell cranks. Now again, because we're using the aluminum ones, we're not going to use the plastic pieces. So we start with 4 of our 3x7x3 bearings, 1 on the top and 1 on the bottom. And well, there we are. So our bell crank, both bell cranks are now ready to be installed with bearings bottom and top. Very good. So now the next step, which will follow here, is to use 2 M3x12mm button head cap screws that will go into the rack from underneath. And these do require a little bit of Loctite, so we'll add some on there. So the bell cranks are now on the steering rack itself. And that's what it looks like right there. I hope you guys can see that. And there's the bottom. Next, we actually need to use this piece here. It comes off this sprue. And we're gonna need this as well, so put that off to the side. So we need this piece here, which is the steering bell crank brace. Now this is what it looks like. It's got this little, I guess, protruding piece sticking off. That actually faces up and away from the arms itself. And we need 2 M3x20 button head cap screws right there. And these will go here and here. And they don't actually bolt in, they just sort of sit like that for right now. So that's that piece there, done. And now we need our 5mm ball stud, which I believe is this one here. And according to the instructions on the supplemental instructions, that is, we are to use the 2mm washer. So and that's that bit there. So I should mention at this point now, we've actually moved on from step 1, which was just assembling the steering rack and the bell cranks. Now we've moved on to step 2, where we've assembled the 2 together, and now we are just going to bolt this onto the front ball stud mount, which is this piece here. So this now goes on here like this. These will bolt onto there. Now, before we actually bolt this onto the ball stud mount, let us put in, there's 2 ball studs with 1mm washers that need to be installed in this hole here and this hole here. So let's do that right now. Okay, so these are the 10mm heavy duty ball studs that are now installed on the front ball stud mount. And now we install the steering rack down here. So let's do that. Okay, so there we have it. This actually brings us to the end of step 2. So now we have our steering rack mounted on our front ball stud mount, and you can see it moves nice and free. Now, if you find that when you assemble yours, don't over tighten these screws here and here. If it doesn't move, just loosen them up a little bit until it starts to move freely like that. And that brings us to the end of parts bag number 1. Now, let's get into parts bag number 2. Alright, so it looks like I've got to step in here. For some reason, my camera's autofocus function decided to just stop working for this little bit of the build. Normally, in a case like this, I just reshoot the affected part of the build, but I didn't notice this happen until after I was well into editing. Good news is that the in-focus video does return in just a bit, and the part of the build that was missed is just the assembly of the front anti-roll bar, which isn't very difficult at all. It simply involves slipping an aluminum collar onto the anti-roll bar itself and holding it in place using an M3 by 2.5mm set screw. I've actually got it up on the screen now so you can see what the instruction manual shows close up. That assembly was then dropped into the ball stud mount, which is when the camera's autofocus began working again. So sorry about that, guys. I'll try not to let it happen again. Now let's get back to the build with some in-focus video. There we are. You guys can see that. And it's just held in place with what looks like 2 M2.5 by 6mm button head cap screws. There we are. It's now installed. And that brings us to the end of bag 2, step 1. Let's move on to step number 2. All right, so on to step number 2. Now, step number 2 is the installation of the front bulkhead. Now, the front bulkhead that comes with the kit is right here, and it's a plastic piece, as you would expect. It indicates there's 25 degree on this end here, and if you turn it around, it's 30 degree. And the standard kit setup calls for 25 degree facing forward on the chassis. However, I'm not going to be using this piece. Now, everyone that I've spoken to, from race drivers to shop owners, all said exactly the same thing. This is sort of a weak point of the B6 chassis, and instead to upgrade to either a aluminum or a brass bulkhead. Now, I have actually opted for the Team Associated Factory Team aluminum bulkhead. This is part number 91658. And as I said, there is a brass version as well. Now, the brass version does put a little bit more weight on the front end of the vehicle, so if you're looking to gain a little bit more traction, or if you want to tune the balance of the vehicle, then maybe the brass one might be good for you. However, I'm going to stick with the aluminum one for now, and I may end up switching to the brass one later on. So I'm not going to be using the plastic kit piece. Instead, I'm going to be using the aluminum one. This goes back in the bin, and let's open this one up right now. Okay, so we now have the aluminum bulkhead out of the package, and we are now going to install it on the chassis plate itself. So let's get our chassis plate out and ready to go. And there it is. That is the B6.3 chassis plate. This is, of course, the 3mm longer chassis plate. My understanding is all that 3mm length is actually added back here. Everything, I guess, pretty much forward from this point is the same as the B6.3D or dirt version. So let's get on with this and install the bulkhead. As per step number 2, we'll install the bulkhead underneath with our steering assembly on top. Now, again, as I said, according to the instructions, the 25 degree, which is the one that I'm going to be going with, should be facing forward in vehicle. So it's going to be installed like this on the chassis. Okay, you guys can see now the bulkhead has been installed and the steering rack and steering assembly is all now in place and moving nice and freely along with the anti-roll bar. That now brings us to the end of step 2, on to step 3. Okay, so step 3 calls for the installation of 2 chassis weights, as well as the 2 side rails, as well as some battery foam pieces, most of which are in this bag here, and we have our side rails right here. So let's get these parts ready for installation. Okay, so I think we now have everything ready in order to go on to step 3. Doesn't look like there's a lot actually going on, but there's a fair going to be going on to this. Now, for some reason, in the 36-gram chassis weight bag, there was what looks like a 1mm washer, and I'm not quite sure where that goes because it's not really mentioned in step 3, so it might be something that we're going to use in a later step, so I'm going to leave that off to the side right there. So let's get started by installing the forward chassis weight. This is a 24mm steel chassis weight, and it's going to be installed right there using 2 by 3mm flathead screws. These are tiny little things right here. I'm not even sure you can really see them, but they're really pretty tiny right there. Let's get these installed. Okay, so that's it. Front chassis weight now installed. Let's move on to the middle chassis weight. This is the 36-gram steel chassis weight. Goes right in there, and it's held in place with 4 of those same small 2 by 3mm flathead screws. Okay, so that's that. The center chassis weight is now installed on the chassis itself. So next step, we'll install these foam strips which support the battery, and as per the instructions, one goes here, the other will go here, and this is just simply tape. All right, so now that the battery foam strips are installed in the milled slots on the chassis, we are ready to install the side rails. Now, there is something to note about the side rails. There's 2 different fastener sizes that we're supposed to use. On the left side of the vehicle, we're supposed to use M3 by 8mm flathead screws, which I have here, and 5 of them. And on the right side of the vehicle, we're supposed to use 3 by 10mm, so 2mm longer, and only 4 of them on the right side of the vehicle. So let's get to installing the side rails right now. Hey guys, I gotta jump in here and correct myself. I actually made a mistake when it comes to the installation of these side rails. Now, I had just said a few seconds ago that there were 5 8mm long countersunk fasteners along one side and 4 10mm long fasteners along the other side. This is wrong. The reality is the 4 10mm long countersunk fasteners are actually here. They hold the front of both side rails in place, and the 5 8mm long, that is to say the shorter fasteners, are along the back bit of the side rails. The 3 are on this side and the 2 are on this side. The instructions in the manual are a little bit confusing, which is what led me to make the mistake in the first place. So if you're building your B6.3 along with me, when you get to this step, don't make the same mistake that I did. All right, let's get back into the build. Okay, so the side rails are now installed. Time to move on to step number 4. All right, so we are now on to step 4 of bag number 2, and we will start by putting together our steering link. The steering link requires these 2 parts here and here off of this sprue. So we'll get those off of there. So these are the parts that we will need to put together our steering link. So that's 2 end links on the end, a small bit of threaded rod, M3 by 10mm, and a 1mm washer. So let's get this thing put together. Okay, so The steering link is now fully assembled. Good. So the next bit is to set up our steering servo with the servo horn. Now, the steering servo that I'm going to be using is this one right here, which is the Savox 1257 TG. Get this thing out of the box. All right. This is the steering servo I'm going to be using for this B6.3 right here. Digital, coreless, competition grade steering servo. All right, so now we also need our servo horn. We're going to need an M3 button head cap screw and an 8mm long stud, as well as a servo horn ring. So 8mm long stud is here. The servo horn will be one of these. So the kit itself actually includes 3 different servo horns. We can see one with a 23 tooth, I believe, 24 tooth, and another 23 tooth, which will obviously fit the different brands of servos, whether Futaba or Savox or Sanwa or whatever, high tech. So you'll use the appropriate one for your servo. So let's figure out which one I need. Okay, so as it turns out, for my particular servo, I need to use the 25 tooth servo horn, and the servo ring itself actually came out of this parts bag here. It's a very nice little blue anodized piece right there. So that'll go on the servo just before the horn goes on. So let's assemble the steering servo right now. Okay, so that now completes the assembly of the steering servo itself. So we've got the horn in place, you can see the horn ring, and of course the ball stud as well. And we also have our little steering link. So that brings us to the end of step 4. Now let's move on to step 5. All right, so let's take a look at step 5. Step 5 is what looks like the assembly and installation of the chassis servo mount system. Now this is the new thing for the B6.3. The previous version, the B6.2, actually had the steering servo mounted to the side rails here and here. So now Associated has actually changed the design so that we're mounting directly to the chassis. So let's get into that. Let's get our parts together. So in this, we're going to need our servo mount blocks. We're going to need our servo mount brace, which is this piece here. And we're going to need 2 M3 by 6mm button head cap screws, which I believe are here. And these are our button head cap screws. So now, with a little bit of Loctite, we can begin to assemble the servo mount system. Okay, so now that is the servo mount system completely assembled. And there we are. Let's move on to the next little bit. The next part of step 5 calls for the servo itself to be mounted to the actual servo mount system itself. So let's get into doing that right now. Okay, so now our servo mount system is now completely assembled. Now I should mention, the 4 screws that are holding the servo in place, I've not fully tightened. I've actually left them a little bit loose. So I'm going to tighten those after the whole system goes down and the entire steering linkage and everything is all basically put together. Then I'll tighten these things down afterwards. So for now, I'm leaving these a little bit loose. So this now brings us to the end of step 5. Let's move on to step 6. All right, we are now on to step 6. Now, step 6 involves the installation of the servo and servo mounting system onto the chassis plate itself, as well as the top front brace onto the chassis as well. So let's start with installing the servo assembly and the mounting system onto the chassis using 2 M3 by 10 millimeter flat head countersunk screws. That is now the servo itself mounted to the chassis using 2 flathead screws. And I installed the steering link to the steering arms themselves. So now I'm going to tighten up the 4 screws that hold the servo in place. All right, so now the servo is fully installed. Let's move on to the front brace. So this is the front brace. It's going to be installed just ahead of the servo itself in this position here. Now, a couple of pieces of plastic that come off. So this piece will be mounted like so, and it's held in place with 2 M3 by 14 millimeter button head cap screws. Let's do that right now. All right, and there we have it. The front brace is now installed. And that brings us to the end of step 6. On to step 7. All right, so we are now on to step 7. Now step 7 begins with us installing 2 button head cap screws into the top of the front brace right here. So let's do that right now. Got them right here. All right, so those 2 screws are now in place. Next step is to install the front sway bar pivot ball. That's this little item here, along with a grub screw, and there's 2 of them, one for one side, one for the other. So get each of those installed right now. Now these are installed such that the front sway bar, when it is installed, the end of it should sit flush with the end of this ball pivot. Let's get into that right now. Okay, so the ball pivots are now installed on the end of the front sway bar. There and there. Good. And now we move on to the next bit where we will install the front hinge pin brace, which is this piece here that was actually packed separately from everything else. So let's open this thing up and take a look. This piece here actually has separate instruction sheet. It's double-sided, so we'll just follow that. And according to the instructions, it says that the front hinge pin brace has a sharp edge and a rounded edge. Mount the sharp edge towards the bulkhead, like that. So that's where that's going to sit. And we now need the A-arms. So let's set this aside for just a moment. And here are the front A-arms. All right, so now we have the front A-arms. The way these are mounted, these mounting holes here on the back, which are for the shocks, they actually face the rear of the vehicle. The front side has nothing on it. So that's how this thing goes on. We also need to install a M2 by 4mm button head cap screw, and these get installed on either side of the A-arm. One on this side and one right in that small hole there. So let's get that done right now. Okay, so those are on there. Let's also install the front sway bar end links. These go on either side of the front sway bar. Might be a little hard to see on camera, but on one side the holes are a little bit smaller than on the other side, so the holes that are slightly larger will actually be going onto the ball heads themselves. So let's do that right now. All right, so front sway bar end links are now installed. So now step 7 requires that we install the hinge pin brace with the lower A-arms onto the front bulkhead. Unfortunately, there's nothing actually holding it in place, so I believe the hinge pins themselves need to be put in, which is actually in step 8. So we're going to consider step 7 done. Let's move on to step 8. All right, so we are now on to step 8. Now step 8 has us installing the front lower A-arms along with the front hinge pin brace, the steel one, and the hinge pins themselves, which are here. Right there, I believe these are 3mm diameter shafts by 24mm long. So let's get those installed right now. And we also need to add some grub screws underneath to the front bulkhead, but we'll get into that in just a second. So let's get this thing started up. All right, so front lower A-arms are now in place. As we can see, they move rather freely. But as I said, we now need to add grub screws. Now, the stock plastic bulkhead required only 1 grub screw per side, but the aluminum Team Associated part actually requires 2 grub screws per side. And those are all right here. So I'll get to installing those right now. Okay, so now the lower front A-arms are now fully installed. Good. So the next step, or the next part of step 8, is to install the lower front bumper using 2 M3 by 16mm flathead countersunk screws. And this here is the front bumper itself. So let's get this thing installed. Okay, so that is now step 8 complete. Front lower suspension arms installed. Let's move on to step number 9. All right, so we are now on to step 9. Now, step 9 is the installation of the front shock tower, the front shock tower cover, and the front wing mount. So let's get into that right now. Now, the front shock tower, there's a couple things I do need to mention. First off, you'll notice there's some countersunk holes on the lower end. These actually face forward, so the flat side actually goes up against the chassis itself. So make sure that these are facing forward. And the other thing I do need to mention is, according to the manual, sort of the stock setup is to use the furthest outside mounting holes for the front shocks, which is what I'm going to be doing. So let's assemble the front shock tower so we can get it onto the chassis. So that's the front shock tower with the front shock pivots in place using 2 M3 by 20mm screws. And now we install the front shock tower cover itself. All right, so now that is the front shock tower assembly complete and ready to be installed on the chassis. So let's do that right now. Now, I should mention, so the front shock tower will actually be mounted onto the chassis like so. I hope you guys can see that. Unfortunately, I think I'm going to have to remove these two upper suspension ball studs so that I can actually gain access to the holes for putting in those fasteners. So I'll do that right now, and we'll install the shock tower. The two lower holes will get two countersunk M3 by 10 millimeter countersunk screws. So let's do that. All right, so now the front shock tower is mounted. I've reinstalled the front suspension ball mounts, and now we can install the front wing mount. So let's do that. The front wing mount itself is this piece here, and it is installed with two M3 by 14 millimeter flat cap screws. So let's do that. Okay, so that is now the front wing mount installed. And that now brings us to the end of parts bag 2 and the end of this build video. If you found any of this useful or even mildly entertaining, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want to follow along with the rest of this build, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and hit that notification bell so that you get notified when I upload the next video. Thanks very much for watching, guys. I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.